Welcome to this webinar, Year 7, Punctuation. I've called it Adventures in Punctuation, and there are three takeaways, three key learning aims. First of all, using colons and semicolons. Secondly, using speech marks. And finally, using dashes. But the overall aim is really to improve your fiction and non-fiction writing, because without the accurate use of punctuation, your non-fiction and fiction writing will really be lacking. So I hope that by the end of this seminar, you'll feel confident about colons, semicolons, speech marks and dashes, and your fiction and non-fiction writing will really improve. Now, let's start with this punctuation mark, the colon. Now, what is a colon? A colon is used to introduce specific examples. So you'll see it in headings. But it's also used to introduce specific explanations. And so you will have a speaker or writer using a colon to emphasize something that is separate. But they also used before a list, and they will separate items and add emphasis to your writing. So here are some examples. Let me give you an example of poisonous berries, deadly nightshade. So here there's a specific example. The writer, a non-fiction writer, is writing about poisonous berries, and there's a specific example. Here, the dragon had one weakness, ice. So this is a fiction example about a dragon, and it's explaining the dragon's weakness. And the colon is used here for a specific explanation. This is also fiction. The hero was prepared and had packed many weapons: swords, blades, rapiers, mallets, tack hammers, and bear claws. So here, the list of these exciting, hopefully effective weapons is being introduced by a colon. So colons make words more distinct. They introduce general ideas and specific ideas, and they use explanations. So he had one problem: time. There was just one rule: do everything you're told. So they have general ideas or specific explanations, and that's how colons are used. They're also introduced for lists. Now, I haven't put the lists here, but I'd like you to fill in the list. Many famous people have been bullied. Do you know famous people who've been bullied, people who've been on television or in newspapers and magazines to explain how they have overcome bullying? You could add the list there. Many charities help young people deal with the effects of bullying. I haven't put the list, but do you know 2 or 3 or 4 charities that deal with bullying and the effects of bullying, and they help young people to cope? And then lists can also be used to introduce speech or direct quotations. So the first one is non-fiction. A wise person once said, "Don't give up without a fight." So you can see that's a direct quotation being introduced by a colon. You could use a comma, but colons can also introduce speech and direct quotations. They shouted, "Be careful, don't get too close to the edge." And you can see this speech, example of kind of dialogue, is introduced with a colon. So can you add a colon to each of these sentences? Have a go. This first one, where would the colon go? He was addicted to coffee, 5 cups at least a day. Where would the colon go for this one? I'll tell you my favorite program, Kind Hearts. Number 3, where would the colon go for this? She didn't have much in her bag: a phone, 3 sweets and a bag of peanuts. Number 4, where would the colon go for this one? Last night I ate the most delicious food ever, my Gran's roast. Where would the colon go for this? Number 5, I love Joey, an absolute legend. Number 6, where would the colon go for this? College is different from school, more independence is needed. And then what about this one? She asked him a very important question: will you marry me? So I hope that you had the colons in the right places. That for number 1, it was after coffee. For number 2, it was after program. For number 3, after bag. For number 4, after ever. For number 5, after Joey. For number 6, after school. And for number 7, after question. Now you can see with a colon, you don't need a capital letter unless the program, Kind Hearts, has a capital letter, or unless you've got speech there. Okay, so that's colons. Let's think about semicolons. Now, this punctuation mark connects ideas. Colons separated them, it made them more distinctive, but semicolons connect ideas. So they are used to show a connection between two parts of a sentence, and they often replace connectives or conjunctions that go in the middle, or we can remember them as fanboys, coordinating connectives and coordinating conjunctions for, and, nor, but, yet, so. So connectives, those kind of connectives or conjunctions can be replaced with a semicolon. However, unlike the colon, both sides of the sentence should make sense without the semicolon. So if you use a semicolon, you could in fact use a full stop, because it means that that is a complete thought connected to another complete thought. Let's look at some examples. It was cold in the kitchen and I danced to keep myself warm. It was cold in the kitchen, semicolon, I danced to keep myself warm. So you can see that both sides of the semicolon make sense. If I replace the semicolon with a full stop, they would still make sense independently. They're independent thoughts. He was fasting, so he resisted the cake. He was fasting, semicolon, he resisted the cake. You can see both of those, although they're interconnected and they're linked. He doesn't eat the cake because he's not eating, he's fasting that day. We can see that they are linked, but they can stand independently. We should not encourage littering, nor should we allow culprits to avoid fines. So that example is non-fiction. We should not encourage littering, semicolon. We should not allow culprits to avoid fines. So it's about littering, the need to fine people who litter, but also to make sure that we encourage people not to litter. And they are interconnected ideas, but they also can stand separately. So the semicolon shows they're interconnected, but we have to use it correctly to make sure that both sides, before and after the semicolon, make sense on their own. So that's the first use of semicolons, connecting ideas. But semicolons can also be used for long lists, and it can make very long lists more manageable to read. So they can be used for lists. Here's an example. We traveled to 4 cities: Santa Fe, which is in New Mexico; Denver, which is the capital of Colorado; Las Vegas in Nevada, and finally Los Angeles in California. So you've got this long list of 4 cities and where they are, and the semicolon helps it to make the list more manageable. Here's another example. The argument was terrible. Ed accused Joe of theft. Joe hurled insults at Ed. Katia started to defend Joe. They were all given detention. So you can see with this long list of all the things that are happening, and accusations and insults and defense and detentions being thrown around and given, that the semicolons make this list more manageable. Only 3 people showed up. Tom from accounting, who had red hair; Maria, who works in sales; Ellie, who was doing an apprenticeship here. So you can see with this list, again introduced by a colon, we've got Tom, Maria, and Ellie. It's giving additional information about each person, and so the semicolon helps to make the list manageable. So these are elaborate and detailed lists. If it were just a normal list, we just use the normal commas after the colon, but these are elaborate and detailed lists, and therefore the semicolons help us. So Can you add semicolons to these sentences? Where would the semicolon go in number 1? She's a really funny person. He isn't at all. Where would the semicolon go in number 2? She didn't really like English. She doesn't really like English. She likes history better. More for her. English is obviously the best subject. No, but where would the semicolon go in that sentence? What about number 3? In the winter, I watch a great deal of TV. In the summer, I hardly watch TV at all. Number 4, Richard likes cake. Susan likes salad. Number 5, I didn't see the step. I've now got a bandage on my head. Number 6, Bill's going bald. His hair's falling out. And number 7, it's important to follow health and safety guidelines. Always wash your hands before handling food. Keep raw meat and cook meat and dairy separate. Check use by dates and never reheat food more than once. So where would the semicolon go on those sentences? They would go here in number 1 after person, number 2 after English, number 3 after baby, number 4 after TV, number 5 after cake, number 6 after I've, number 7 after bald, and for number 8, it would be after food and after separate. And you can see that that's a long, elaborate, detailed list, the last one, and therefore you'd have semicolons to make that list more manageable. Okay, so colons separate ideas. Semicolons show that they are interlinked. So we have the one sentence, we have a problem, he isn't doing enough to help me. Using a semicolon, we have a problem, semicolon, he isn't doing enough to help me. You can see they're separate ideas, but they're interlinked with the semicolon. We have a problem, his lack of support. That's making it more distinctive and emphasizing what the problem is with a specific explanation using the colon. Right, let's talk about punctuating speech. Now, punctuating speech has several rules. This is really for fiction writing. When you add speech or dialogue, you give an insight into the character, their relationships, the events that are happening. You give a clue of what's going to happen. So using speech, using dialogue in fiction writing is really fabulous when you really give the feeling of the character and you give it a really strong indication of the conflict in the situation. But we have to use speech accurately. So you can see the 3 examples at the bottom. Jackie said, let's wind him up. You can see the kind of character that Jackie is. Boring, isn't he? Said Steve. Tell him to stop. And then your problem is, we said, you never listen. So it's showing the conflict and adding that sense of character in fiction writing. But we need to follow some of the punctuation rules for speech. So the first one is about opening and closing speech marks. The opening and closing speech marks need to surround all the words spoken. Let's wind him up. All of that was spoken, so that goes with the opening speech marks and the closing speech marks, completely surrounding it like brackets, like a blanket. We also notice that there's a capital letter after the opening speech marks. Let's wind him up. Boring. Tell him to stop. Your problem. They have capital letters. They're capitalized because they are directly after the opening speech mark, the first piece of speech that's after a sentence. Then the question marks, the exclamation marks, the full stops are all tucked in before the closing speech marks. So the exclamation mark, the question mark, full stop, they're all tucked in before the closed speech marks. We can see, as we said earlier, that the colon can be used to introduce the speech, but when Jackie said, let's wind him up, you can see the colon there. And then if we don't have a full stop and we have the continuation of speech, your problem is, we said, you never listen. So the you there, the continued speech without end punctuation, you can see commas, not full stops, not exclamation marks, not question marks. They're not end punctuation, it's commas. With continued speech, we don't need a capital letter. Your problem is, we said, so it's interrupted, we said, and the speech continues, you never listen. So we don't have a capital letter for that second you in the last example. Okay, how can you see how to punctuate this speech? How would this be punctuation? Can you keep your voice down? Said Vanessa. Everyone's looking at us. So can you see where the opening and closing speech marks would be, where the question mark would be and the full stop, and where the capital letters would be? What about number 2? Can't you understand? Asked Harriet. No one will tell you the truth except me. So where would the opening and closed speech marks be? Where would the capital letters and the question marks be? Number 3, stop being so stubborn, said Gary. You don't normally act like an untrained dog. So again, it's adding humour to the fiction writing through speech. Where would the exclamation marks be? Where would the capital letters be? And where would the speech marks be? What a crazy fool, said Kerry. He thinks he's invincible, doesn't he? And then number 5, he's childish, said Carla, and he doesn't realise his impact on all of his family. Can you see this one's interrupted speech? He's childish, said Carla, and he doesn't realise his impact on his family. So that would be different. How would you punctuate that? Well, I hope that you understand that for this one, you've got the question mark and the speech marks all around the speech. For this one, again, you've got the question mark and the speech marks all around the speech. You've got the exclamation mark for this one and the capital letters. You've got exclamation again and doesn't he, and all of the speeches around the speech marks. But for this one, you've got the comma and the interrupted speech. We don't have a capital letter after the opening speech marks. Okay, for the part, that's it then. Opening speech marks and closing speech marks surround all the words spoken. A capital letter needs to come in the first after the opening speech marks. Question marks, exclamation marks, full stops, they're all tucked in before the closed speech marks. Colons can introduce speech, and then if it's interrupted speech or continued speech, we don't always need the capital letter. So for the last part of this webinar, we're going to talk about the dashing, diverse, and versatile dash. Now, the dash can come in a single or it can come in pairs like speech marks or like brackets. So the dash can be used like a semicolon. It can expand and develop a sentence. I booked the holiday, dash. He has all the fun. So that can be like a semicolon. It's developing the sentence. We can see they're interlinked and they're interrelated. But the dash can also be adding extra information like brackets. They can come in pairs. So we've got the example there. Just then, Tom, my second cousin, got home from work. So the dash can come in pairs. It can act like brackets. Your results will depend, as my gran used to say, on how much effort you put in. We can put the dashes there in pairs to add that extra information on both sides. But then they can also be like a colon to separate and to add emphasis. Mrs. Brown demands one thing from her pupils, attention. So the dash is acting like a colon, but it can also show hesitation in speech, like or interruption in speech. Mum, can I have some more No, you'll ruin your dinner. So you didn't get to finish that word chocolate. And then I can't, not a dragon, she screamed. So it shows that hesitation in dialogue. So the dash is incredibly diverse. It's really versatile. So you can use it semicolon or brackets or like a colon, or even to show hesitation and interruption. Now, what is the difference between a hyphen and a dash? We can see that hyphens are shorter. They link little words together. So we can say well-built, hit and run, strong-willed, water-resistant, red-haired. They're hyphenated words. They're shorter than dashes and they link and stick words together, kind of like blue tack or glue dots. They stick them together, whereas dashes add separate information. So you can see we've got a hyphen in that sentence. He was a well-built personal trainer. We've also got dashes. His muscles were huge. So it's adding that extra information and he gained many clients. So you've got dashes and hyphens in that last one. Dashes are shorter, they link words together. Hyphens are shorter, they link words together, but dashes are longer and they give us separate, more additional information. So let's pull it all together. You can see here in these examples, I've used semicolons, colons, speech marks, and dashes. The chaotic street surrounded Mia. Confused tourists, busy traders, giggling school kids. So that colon introduces a list of all the things around Mia. However, Mia didn't notice the cramped and claustrophobic buses that roared past her bench. She was sleeping. So the semicolon shows why she didn't notice. She was sleeping. They're separate ideas, but they're interconnected by the semicolon. Eventually, the teeming pavements behind her and the crowded roads in front of her brought her into consciousness, and she began to mutter. So that colon is used to introduce speech. I've lost my bus pass. Searching her bag in a frantic panic now as the red cumbersome vehicle approached. So you can see the dashes there are used for interruption and hesitance in the speech, but they're also used like brackets to add additional information in a frantic panic now. I hope that's helped you to see how you can use colons, semicolons, speech marks, and dashes to improve your non-fiction and your fiction writing. Thank you for joining me.